The Kremlin tweeting out that the Russian military operation, as they call it, is going according to plan. But the rest of the world, including leaders at the NATO Emergency Summit meeting, are more concerned with Putin launching World War III and the real possibility of using chemical weapons in a threat that was made by Putin. Joining us now to discuss is former CIA Covert Operations Officer and CEO of the Portman Square Group, Mike Baker. Mike, good to see you. Thanks so much for coming on here.
Sure, thank you.
So we've got these leaders, NATO leaders meeting, G7 leaders, leaders of the EU meeting again with President Biden. This as Putin continues now into the second month in Ukraine. How do you rate the United States response, NATO's response, even keeping in mind that Ukraine is not a part of NATO, but really, what is at stake here if Putin continues to push westward?
Well, that's you pointed at the very end there, you pointed to the real key here, which is what are Putin's intentions, right? What are his plans and intentions? And that's been the big missing part of this puzzle for some time, trying to understand, does he intend just to create a situation where he ends up with the eastern part of the region? Is he pounding Mariupol into rubble because he essentially just wants that as part of his deal so that he can connect the Donbass to Crimea? Or does he, at this point, believe that the only exit ramp for him is just to take the whole country and break it? So I think at this point we have to be pragmatic. We have to look at, as you pointed out, Ukraine's not part of NATO. Nobody wants to get into a shooting match with Russia. That's been discussed ad nauseum. So I think the White House, the Biden administration, and NATO, if you're pragmatic about it and set politics aside, they're doing, in reality, about as much as can be done. I know there's been talk about the specific instances, the MiGs, or can we provide more javelins, more stingers? Well, yes, you can provide more javelins and stingers, but I think at a certain point, there is a hard line that you have to say, in defense of a country that's not in NATO, you're not going to, as the White House, as NATO has pointed out, put troops in there. You're not going to get in there with a no-fly zone, which would be enormously chaotic and possibly lead to that direct conflict. So, while I don't agree with a number of things that the Biden administration has done, I do think that there's a limit here that can be done practically by any administration, regardless of where their politics are.
And you mentioned a red line. In so many ways, we saw that yesterday when the president spoke in terms of chemical weapons used. Let me play that sound for you. I'll get your reaction. Here's that.
We would respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use. It would trigger a response in kind. Whether or not you're asking whether NATO would cross, we'd make that decision at the time.
Again, is that the red line?
Well, it hasn't been in the past, and that's the problem that we're looking at. Vladimir Putin, his command staff, they know who they're dealing with. They know President Biden from the Obama administration. They know the team members that are on Biden's administration at this point, making various decisions regarding the strategy of our response. They remember fully well, back in the 2000s in Syria, when that very same statement almost was made by President Obama, that there is a red line, that there will be response, it will be harsh. And you know what? It wasn't. So part of the problem that we've been facing is Putin and his team are looking at President Biden and his team and saying, we know these cats. We know who they are. We know what they're going to do. We know what they're not going to do. So let's move. And that makes it a much more difficult calculus in terms of what Putin's response is going to be than anything that we or the West do.
And just coming in, too, and I want to attribute this to Reuters, that the United States and NATO are conducting a contingency plan for possible Russian attack on NATO soil. I believe that was White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan saying today as President Biden is traveling to Poland. So they're not blocking it out. And it really goes back to the beginning portion of our conversation, that if Putin continues his troops westward, they are preparing a contingency plan. Again, that just coming in case that happens. If you want to respond to that, what would a contingency plan really look like? Does that look like we send more troops over? I know we've already sent, well, I know the United States has sent more troops over to Europe than we've already have bases there as well. Does that mean more troops, more weaponry?
Well, it likely would be within the boundaries that we've already set, frankly. And to be fair, look, every administration, engages in gaming out these scenarios. What would be an appropriate response? Whether we're talking about a chemical attack by a hostile nation, whether we're talking about a major cyber attack, the Pentagon and the White House National Security Team spends a great deal of time putting together what could be a proportional response. Now, the difference with this situation as opposed to the Syrian situation when Putin was side by side with Assad and there was use of chemical weapons is that we're talking about NATO, right? And we're talking about that sort of action taking place on border NATO countries. And that could change the dynamic in terms of what our response would be and how forceful the response would be. Again, part of this problem is what's happening with Putin, what's happening with his inner circle, how much actual intelligence and quality assessment is being fed to Putin to sort of determine his next moves.
Right.
And all anecdotal evidence and some hard intelligence is showing he is shrinking that circle. He is going through almost a Stalinist purge of some of his key personnel. And that's a dangerous aspect.
Let me jump in really quick. I got 30 seconds left with you. You had Secretary of State Antony Blinken, NSA Jake Sullivan, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, Vice President Kamala Harris, all saying that sanctions were imposed to deter Russia. President Biden at the NATO summit says he never said that sanctions would deter Russia. Final thoughts from you.
Yeah, mixed messaging, not uncommon from this current administration here. That's just another example. Look, we all know what we see. We all know what we hear. And frankly, sanctions have always been put on the table with the hope that they would be a deterrent, whether it's with this situation or in the past. Typically, as Greg Zanetti pointed out, your previous guest, sanctions haven't worked. They certainly, financial incentive sanctions haven't worked with Putin in the past. But we know what we heard. We know that the White House was using sanctions early on as a deterrent. They can't really pivot now and have anybody, logically believe that.
All right, we'll leave it right there. Mike Baker, always good to hear from you. Have a great weekend. Thanks for your time.
You too. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Rob Finnerty. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please join the conversation in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, too. Hit the bell icon to be alerted to breaking news. And remember, there's a whole lot more on Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news network. Newsmax TV, we're real news for real people.